At 84 years old, Dionne Warwick has finally spoken out. Not in a press release, not in a tabloid, but in a way that feels raw, honest, and long overdue. What she said about Michael Jackson stunned even those who thought they knew everything. But this isn't just about Michael. It's about the price of fame. It's about what happens behind the spotlight when the music stops and the cameras cut. And it's about a woman who lived through all of it quietly, watching the rise, the fall, and the fractures in between. Now, with nothing left to prove, Dionne is telling the story the world missed. Not the version with platinum records and glitter gloves. The real one. And once you hear it, you'll never look at either of them the same again. Before the fame, before the Grammys, and long before anyone called her a legend, Dionne Warwick was just a little girl in East Orange, New Jersey, surrounded by music, but never allowed to treat it like a game. In her family, singing wasn't a hobby, it was a responsibility. Her mother managed a renowned gospel group. Her father was a record promoter. And her cousin? None other than Whitney Houston. Music didn't run in the family, it defined it. By the time Dionne was a child, she was already performing at the New Hope Baptist Church. The songs weren't flashy, they were gospel raw, emotional, and demanding. Every note had to mean something. Every lyric was a message. She later joined the Gospelaires, a group she formed with her sister and cousins, and even as a teenager, her voice was described as hauntingly mature. Smooth, restrained, but somehow powerful enough to shake a room. But behind the harmonies and Sunday morning applause, there was pressure, unspoken expectations. When your whole family breathes music, there's no room to fail. She was expected to carry the weight of talent, grace, and tradition, all while being just a kid. There were no shortcuts, no coddling, only discipline. And it didn't take long for the outside world to come knocking. Dionne Warwick didn't explode onto the scene with glitter and headlines. She slipped in like a secret everyone suddenly knew. Discovered in the early 60s by the iconic songwriting duo Burt Bacharach and Hal David, Dionne became the voice their music needed. But it wasn't just talent that set her apart, it was control, precision, a kind of emotional clarity that didn't need to shout to be heard. While others were chasing fame with powerful belts and showy drama, Dionne stayed calm, elegant, and impossibly smooth. She made heartbreak sound graceful. She made longing feel timeless. Hits like Walk On By, Do You Know the Way to San Jose, and I Say a Little Prayer didn't just chart, they haunted people. But success came at a price. The music industry, especially for a black woman in the 1960s, wasn't built for ease. Dionne was constantly walking a tightrope, elegant enough for mainstream pop, soulful enough to stay true to her roots, quiet enough to be accepted, powerful enough not to be forgotten. And as the spotlight grew brighter, so did the expectations. Every hit raised the bar. Every award came with whispers of, "What's next?" There was no space to stumble, no permission to be tired. She wasn't just building a career, she was navigating an industry that demanded perfection but gave little in return. And while she sang about love, loss, and prayer, very few knew what she was actually going through. Because behind the voice, her personal life was already beginning to unravel. At the height of her success, Dionne Warwick seemed untouchable. Her name was everywhere on radios, billboards, television screens. But behind the poise and polished vocals, her personal life was becoming a storm no chart position could calm. In 1966, she married actor and jazz drummer William Elliott. On the surface, it looked like the perfect match, two artists, both rising, both talented, both immersed in the rhythm of performance. But almost as soon as the cameras clicked, the cracks began to show. They divorced just a year later, quietly, quickly. No dramatic statements, no headlines, just distance. And yet, just months after ending it, they stunned everyone by getting married again. This time in Milan, Italy, far from the noise, the industry, the judgment. Maybe it was a fresh start, maybe it was denial. But even a change of scenery couldn't fix what was already broken. Their second try brought two sons. David in 1969 and Damon in 1973, both of whom would grow into musical talents themselves. From the outside, it looked like the family had settled into something stable. But inside? the foundation was already eroding. The deeper Dionne fell into her career touring, recording, pushing herself to stay relevant in a brutal industry, the more the marriage suffered. William, once a performer in his own right, struggled with the growing financial and emotional gap between them. She was the star, she was the provider, and it began to wear them both down. By 1975, they were done, for good this time. The divorce wasn't just personal, it became public and painfully revealing. Elliott asked for support payments, citing a massive income gap. Dionne, who was making 6 figures a month, was expected to bankroll a man who couldn't keep up professionally or personally. The court sided with her, but the damage was deeper than legal fees. Later, Dionne would reflect on it all with a kind of blunt honesty you rarely hear from icons. "I was the breadwinner," she said. "The male ego is a fragile thing." She had built an empire and in doing so, lost the one thing she thought might anchor her outside of music. But the story didn't end with heartbreak, because both of her sons would take that legacy and carry it in their own way. For most artists, legacy ends with the last hit. But for Dionne Warwick, hers lived on in blood, in melody, and in the next generation. Her eldest son, David Elliott, didn't take the obvious route. Before he ever stepped onto a stage, he served as a Los Angeles police officer living in a world far from microphones and spotlights. But music had a way of pulling him back. And when it did, he came not just as a son, but as a collaborator. In 1993, he co-wrote "Love Will Find a Way," a deeply personal duet performed by Dionne and her cousin, the late Whitney Houston. It wasn't just a song, it was a moment, 3 generations of musical history woven into one track. It marked the beginning of David's journey from behind the scenes to the center of it all. By the early 2000s, he was touring with his mother not as a backup act, but as her drummer and featured vocalist. Together, they shared the stage in a way few families ever do. Sometimes, during their duets, you could feel it, that mix of love, legacy, and something unspoken, a mother and son speaking in notes instead of words. But David wasn't done. In 2001, he made his film debut in Ali, portraying the legendary soul singer Sam Cooke. A role that didn't just require acting chops, it demanded musical authenticity. He delivered both. He'd go on to contribute to projects like Luther Vandross's Grammy-winning Here and Now, blending his songwriting talent with emotional depth that mirrored his mother's. Quietly, steadily, he was becoming a creative force of his own. And then came Damon Elliott, Dionne's younger son, and arguably one of the most versatile producers of his era. His resume reads like a mixtape of the 2000s. Pink, Christina Aguilera, Mia, Keisha Cole, just to name a few. Damon didn't just work with stars, he helped shape their sound. In 2006, he did something that brought his journey full circle. He produced his mother's album My Friends and Me, a modern reinterpretation of her classics, now performed with a new wave of female artists. It was more than a tribute. It was proof. Dionne's music wasn't frozen in time. It was evolving. And her own son was guiding the transformation. Damon's production style was crisp, emotional, genre-bending. He brought new life to Dionne's iconic catalog, bridging a gap between generations while never losing the heart of her sound. Together, David and Damon didn't just carry their mother's legacy, they amplified it. In the studio, on tour, on screen, they proved that the Warwick lineage wasn't just about history, it was about reinvention. But even as her sons rose in the industry, Dionne was facing a new kind of battle, one that wasn't about chart-topping singles or broken marriages. It was about the version of herself the public had never seen. To the public, Dionne Warwick was untouchable, regal, poised, timeless. Her voice had become the soundtrack to love, heartbreak, hope. And even as trends changed, even as younger artists took the spotlight, she never faded. She floated through the decades with a kind of quiet command. But the truth is, grace can be exhausting. And behind Dionne's polished image was a woman constantly fighting to stay whole in a world that chipped away at her piece by piece. Through the 80s, she reinvented herself again. With the charity hit That's What Friends Are For, alongside Elton John, Gladys Knight, And Stevie Wonder, she wasn't just making a comeback, she was turning her music into a mission. The song raised millions for AIDS research and brought compassion to a topic few were willing to touch. It became more than a hit, it became a movement. But even as her music healed others, Dionne rarely gave herself permission to fall apart. She became a UN global ambassador, an advocate for food security, education, and equality. She lent her name and voice to causes bigger than fame while privately navigating losses, betrayals, and industry battles most fans never knew about. She was, in many ways, the model of strength, particularly for Black women in entertainment. But that strength came at a cost. The pressure to never complain, to smile when things fell apart, to be both legend and human without letting anyone see the cracks. Even in her later years, Dionne never faded into obscurity. She hosted Solid Gold in the 1980s. She stayed in the public eye through interviews, game shows, and eventually, with something no one expected, a Twitter account that went viral for its wit, warmth, and unfiltered truth. Young fans started calling her the Queen of Twitter. But those tweets, sharp and funny as they were, masked something deeper, a lifetime of choosing dignity over drama, silence over scandal, and truth delayed, but never denied. And as her own story neared its final chapters, she knew there was still one thing she had never spoken on. Someone she had watched rise and fall just like she had. His name was Michael Jackson. She met him before the world knew his name. Before the glove, before the moonwalk, before the world turned him into something larger and lonelier than life. Dionne Warwick first crossed paths with Michael Jackson when he was still a boy. A prodigy, yes, but a child nonetheless. She saw him backstage at Motown events, wide-eyed, soft-spoken, and already carrying a weight no child should bear. There was something otherworldly about him, she said. Even when he smiled, there was a sadness behind it. Coming from someone who had lived her own life under the spotlight, those words carried weight. She saw what others missed. She saw how the pressure from his father, from the industry, from the unrelenting public gaze was already shaping him. Or more accurately, breaking him. She remembered watching him rehearse, eyes focused, movements precise. Not like a child trying to impress adults, but like someone trying to survive. Even then, he wasn't performing for applause. He was performing to belong. Over the years, as her career evolved and his skyrocketed, Dionne stayed mostly silent. She watched from a distance as Michael morphed from child star to global phenomenon to public obsession. And all the while, she saw what the world refused to see, the human being beneath the icon. Michael was like a sponge, she said. He soaked up everything, the love, the praise, the cruelty, the demands, but a sponge can only hold so much before it starts to fall apart. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a warning. She recalled visiting Motown studios, seeing the rehearsals, the exhaustion, the isolation. Fame had given Michael everything and taken even more. To Dionne, his transformation wasn't shocking. It was inevitable. The boy who never got to be a child was now the man who would never get to just be a man. They shared stages, collaborators, and the unique burden of being Black artists who had to be extraordinary just to be accepted. But their connection ran deeper than career paths. It was spiritual, emotional, unspoken. And while Dionne never claimed to know all the answers about Michael Jackson, what she did know was this. The world adored his image, but it never understood his soul. To Dionne Warwick, the real tragedy of Michael Jackson's life wasn't the controversies, the surgeries, or the headlines. It was the fact that no one ever truly saw him. The world saw a spectacle, she said. They saw the glove, the moonwalk, the scandals, but they didn't see the little boy who never got to grow up. For decades, Michael was chased by paparazzi, by fans, by lawsuits, by questions no one would ever stop asking. And through it all, he kept trying to be something the world could love. Something perfect, something magical. But perfection is a prison. Dionne believed that the person behind the persona, the soft-spoken, gentle, and strangely isolated man was rarely allowed to exist. And that's what broke him, not just the fame, the loneliness. He tried to hold on to something innocent inside of him, she said, even as the world kept taking pieces of him away. She remembered moments when his eyes would flicker with that same sadness she saw as a child. The way he'd laugh, but never for long. The way his voice got quieter when the cameras weren't rolling. And she never forgot how empty the applause must have felt when it was all he'd ever known. When asked about the darker parts of his legacy, the accusations, the speculation, the media obsession, Dionne didn't flinch, but she didn't condemn. She simply said, "I'm not here to rewrite history, but I do believe in compassion." Because to her, Michael wasn't a headline or a court case. He was a man in pain, a man who gave joy to billions, but couldn't always find it for himself. She didn't ask people to forget. She asked them to remember better. To remember that behind the icon was a human being fragile, flawed, and deserving of empathy, just like all of us. And at 84, Dionne wasn't trying to change the story. She was trying to complete it. So why now? Why, after decades of silence, did Dionne Warwick finally speak about Michael Jackson, about fame, pressure, pain, and what the industry does to the ones it claims to love? The answer is simple. She's not trying to protect a legacy. She's trying to free it. At 84, Dionne has nothing left to prove, no image to uphold, no career move to calculate. What she has finally is the clarity that only time can give. And with that clarity comes a kind of courage no stage ever required of her, the courage to tell the truth. Because for years, she watched as narratives were shaped by tabloids, talk shows, and trial transcripts. She saw how public opinion turned real people into characters, then into caricatures, then into headlines. She's lived it herself. And now, she's using her voice not to sing, but to speak, to remind the world that even the brightest stars cast shadows, that behind every legend is a life. A fragile, complicated, human life. "I'm speaking now," she said, "because too many of us waited too long to say what needed to be said." She's not defending. She's not rewriting. She's remembering with compassion, with pain, and with the wisdom of someone who's seen both the spotlight and the silence that follows. What Dionne Warwick wants isn't sympathy. It's awareness. Awareness of how we treat our icons, how we consume their talent, then question their worth, how we love them loudly when they rise, and abandon them quietly when they fall. She's speaking now because Michael can't. Because too many can't. And because if the truth doesn't come from someone who knew him, who saw him, then it may never come at all. In the end, Dionne Warwick's story isn't just about one woman or one legendary family. It's about the cost of fame and the price of silence. It's a reminder that behind every headline, every record, every dazzling performance, there are real people, flawed, fragile, and deeply human. Her decision to speak now challenges us all to reconsider how we see the stars we admire, to look past the glamour and the gossip, and to ask, what are we asking of them? How much can one person bear when the whole world watches and judges? Dionne's words echo long after the spotlight fades. Fame doesn't just change people, it can break them. But truth, raw, unfiltered truth, has the power to heal, to humanize, to connect. As we close this chapter, perhaps the most important legacy Dionne offers is this: empathy. The call to listen closely, to understand deeply, and to remember that no one, no matter how famous, is beyond the reach of compassion. Because at the end of the day, that's the story worth telling.